So far now, I've started every video with an apology, so I think that should become a tradition somewhat. I'm sorry about the setup today. I had about 2 minutes to set everything up. I'm sorry that the microphone stands in the way, etc., etc. Let's just get going. So I wanted to make a video about this, obviously, because of the dates that are approaching and what they mean, what the heated debate about what they should mean, what we should celebrate, what we shouldn't celebrate, etc. So I wanted to talk about Native American literature, mostly my own experience with it, my own recommendations of what you should read. But to preface this video, I also want to talk briefly about what Native American literature is and how to approach it, how to read it. There is indeed a way in which it is sensible and most effective to approach literature like this. And hopefully this will become a useful tool, not just to read Native American literature, but literature of any marginalized or disenfranchised group of people in general. I think there are some specific guidelines that we should always keep in mind when we approach literature like that. So I don't want to make any sort of broad political statements about what you should think, what you shouldn't think, though maybe I will in the course of the video just because of the nature of the subject matter. But I do want to make it clear that whatever it is that your beliefs are, if you're interested in Native American literature, you should definitely give it a try, but you should also definitely read it with an approach in mind that might be a little different from what you're used to utilizing when reading any other type of literature out there. So of course, Native American literature is an invention that came about after the incidents of colonization and genocide that took place in our nation following the arrival of white Europeans. Of course, most of the storytelling traditions of Native American were oral in nature, and a lot of it was visual in nature as well. Native American literature is something that is inherently post-colonial. When you approach Native American literature, you should always keep in mind that it is the result of this violent encounter between two very different cultures and nations. You should also try to keep in mind the nature of what Native American literature aims to accomplish. And indeed, if you keep that in mind for Native American literature, you should also keep that in mind for the literature of Black Americans and the literature of any other marginalized community in the U.S., more so than a history of being appreciated, studied, and celebrated. The literature of minorities actually has a more extended community in being dismissed, ridiculed, or altogether ignored in a lot of American learning institutions, particularly universities. The white sort of approach to a lot of this literature was a celebration of its dismissal. In fact, most white scholars who during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, which is around the time that the literature of minorities started to demand a forefront in literary discussion, it was during these decades that a lot of white scholars tended to dismiss it or delegitimize it in some way. That is the brutal scholarly nature that a lot of this literature is emerging from. So you should keep in mind that the purposes of a lot of this literature that is written is not necessarily to inform, it's not necessarily to persuade or dissuade white readers into becoming interested in it. In fact, a lot of it is not written with white audiences in mind. A lot of white scholars who approach this literature in particular tend to feel attacked, or they tend to feel like the literature is being dismissive or patronizing or antagonistic towards them. That might indeed be the case with some of it. I don't know. I haven't really read that much that actually is. But you should always keep in mind, especially if you come from a place of privilege, which I think most of us do, myself included, you should always approach this literature with the idea that it's not about you. And leaving that sort of ego besides yourself is very crucial for approaching a lot of this work. Ego is something I think is inherently part of our reading experiences. When we read something, we are usually by ourselves. We are usually intaking it through our own consciousness and interiority, as you know, the nature of literary studies mostly is. So it is quite difficult to put that besides ourselves, but I think it is a crucial exercise if you're interested in reading literature like this. And you should know that the motto for a lot of minority literature is that words are bullets. Words are being used to weaponize ideas, to mobilize ideas. A lot of minority literature is centered around the motif of empowering and elevating the experience of a minority group that might not necessarily relate to the goals or the interests that you have in mind when approaching literature in general, but do keep in mind that that is a very different and that is a very visible part of a lot of the literature that's written. A lot of it is not meant to entertain. A lot of it is not meant to just, give you an insight into your own personal life. Those are purposes that usually need to be left out of the experience of reading literature like this. And finally, if you're interested in literature of writers like James Baldwin, you will know that a lot of the criticism that's made in some of the writing that he's done has to do with the failure of a white cognition or a white sentimentality that actually tends to shut off a lot of those crucial approaches towards the literature of blacks or Native Americans that I've discussed, simply because it's just a psychological defense to try to justify yourself rather than first try to understand the words of someone else. There is a long history of it that you can indeed look up if you're more interested in that. But ultimately, I think you need to understand that the reading list, so to speak, that I will be giving you in this video is not part of some broader reading list that you should keep in mind when book shopping or, I feel like killing an hour or two, let me pick up one of these books. The reading list that I am trying to give you in this video is for your own consideration if you are truly interested in learning more about the plight of marginalized groups, if you're interested in mobilizing your ideas, mobilizing your actions towards the benefit of other minority groups. You should keep in mind that reading lists in nature tend to be very controversial and problematic. A lot of the times reading lists to a lot of people read like shopping lists. It is a way of commercializing, infantilizing and de-weaponizing literature. And of course, that is absolutely not the purpose of the video that I am trying to make. Because this reading list you should take as an introduction into a world that definitely needs your attention, definitely needs your efforts, and definitely needs for you to maybe alter the way of thinking that you've had for most of your life. With that being said, I want to briefly go through 4 books written by Native American writers about the Native American experience that I've read. Most of these I've read through my college years, and they have been absolutely life-changing, and I recommend that most people, in fact more specifically maybe most Americans, at least try to give these books a chance. The first book that I have here is Ceremony by Leslie Marmon Silko. This book is set in the Laguna Pueblo Reservation, and it follows the story of Tayo, a Native American who's coming back from war. This book definitely centers mostly around the issues of war and the casualties of war, primarily World War II, that left such an incredible physical but also psychological toll on a lot of minorities. It mostly takes place in the Native American reservation, but a lot of it moves the action, of course, across the continent. It also has a lot to do with traditions, rituals that take place in Native American reservations, what they mean to the people that are so historically removed from their original meaning, but ultimately seeks for a way of healing in terms of the character's own plight with his masculinity, with his sense of self, with his sense of community. If you're interested in learning about the financial and psychological burdens that Native American reservations have had historically, then this is absolutely a phenomenal book that you must read. Another book that I would like to recommend is Lois Eldridge's Tracks. Lois Eldridge is a sort of controversial figure in writing. She's certainly had a very tumultuous life and experienced all sorts of criticism when she was first coming out throughout the 80s and 90s as an emergent Native American writer. This story follows the journey of a Native American woman named Fleur, and it interposes her narrative with the narrative of other people that are living around her in the reservation that she calls her home. It deals with a lot of issues ranging from alcoholism to even existential despair, poverty, of course, inner reservation violence, which is something that has become a lot more prominent since. I think there's a lot of discussions about the violence that particularly Native American women face when they live in reservations. There's a lot of sexual assault, murder, and those are subjects that are rarely ever discussed. If you're interested in learning about the Native American reservation from a female perspective of a female character, I think Eldridge is always a great place to start. And she is also a prominent author of a lot of children's literature. If you're interested in that, I believe one of her books is called the Birch Bark House, which is about Native American life before the Pilgrims arrived. And it's certainly a very insightful look into the history and the sense of community that existed, and that we hardly ever see sort of be romanticized or upheld in any sort of literature. And if you're interested, of course, in reading to children about these issues, Eldridge is also a very great place to start. Next up, I have a book that I read recently, which is called There There, and this is written by Tommy Orange. This is a book that has been sensationalized. It was a New York Times bestseller. I'm sure a lot of people have heard of it, and I think that's a good thing. This book takes the action into Oakland, California, and then indeed follows very, very different strands of people as they try to come to terms with their identity, with their tradition, with their sense of what the modern day Native American struggle looks like, if it can even be called that anymore. Indeed, it brings up a lot of questions about the term Native and Native American. Is it outdated? Does it even hold any meaning to a lot of these people anymore? Of course, it deals with issues of miscegenation, with identities of people who are Native American by heritage, but also have white or Mexican cultures in their bloodline as well. And how do you reconcile that identity with the other warring ideals inside your body? Do you consider yourself Native American? What does it mean to be Native American? What do ceremonies, rituals, and traditions even mean anymore to people like this? I thought it was a phenomenal book. It is incredibly, depressing and forlorn look into the modern day Native American experience. But I think that is a crucial thing for everybody to learn about and experience for themselves. And I think a lot of this literature would be considered depressing or would be considered a bummer. But again, that is the point of view of somebody who is approaching the literature from the standpoint that it should first and foremost entertain or speak to yourself. If your own, tastes don't particularly enjoy sad stories or anything, I don't think that is a valid excuse to dismiss a lot of this literature. If a lot of this literature doesn't tend to be happy, then that should speak more about your own experience rather than, be grounds for you to dismiss or critique it. And finally, it's a book, a children's book that I actually read as part of a book club that I was in with a couple of other friends. This was the recommendation of a friend of mine. She is a teacher, and she said that this book completely amazed her, and that she recommends it thoroughly to her students and of course to us. This is The Absolute True Diary of a Part-Time Indian by Sherman Alexie. This is written from the perspective of a kid living in a reservation. His name is Arnold, but everybody calls him Junior. And it's written with this, of course, very boyish, very childlike perspective. A lot of it, from whatever it is, autobiographic in nature, given Alexie's own experience growing up in a reservation, with his own health and educational issues. The vast majority of it centers around education. It's about Junior going from the school that the reservation has, which is, of course, very lacking in resources and really any opportunity. He's a brilliant kid, so on the recommendation of a lot of teachers, he moves to a primarily white school outside of the reservation. A lot of it is written with humor, which, as I was saying before, this might be a good sort of introductory space because, while the nature of the story is very tragic and depressing and absolutely horrible in some passages in the things that he had to live through, it is written with this very childlike glee. It is, very humorous. It's meant to be humorous. But ultimately the experience that you get from it is a very holistic view into what it is like growing in a reservation and what it is like experiencing things like discrimination, poverty, alcoholism from the perspective of a child. I do think that it is a phenomenal book. It is very well written. It is absolutely hilarious and, of course, insightful and very sad in a lot of places. So I know I kind of rush through the list as opposed to what I've done in the past, which is, talk for 40 minutes about a couple of books. But there's a reason for that, and that is that I don't want to try to sit here and analyze and put my own words into what the stories mean, what the stories are saying. I think a lot of this literature was written to be experienced through the collective action of reading. I think a lot of these books also work especially well with, like I said, a book club or a community reading setup, because they are books that warrant a lot of discussion. So I don't want to, give my own words too much. I simply want to sort of show you what the books are and give you a few words on why they are important, or at least why they were important to me. And if you do choose to read them, again, keep in mind the words that I gave you at the beginning of the video, because it is a very important set of steps to follow when approaching literature that is not necessarily meant to just entertain or inspire you. So I hope that with these days and with this video, you have a lot of at least a little bit more conscience on Native American literature, Native American authors, Native American history and experience. I do think it is important to remember. I do think it is important to learn about it, and I do think it should be considered some kind of duty to approach literature like this with a very open and active mind. So whatever it is that you choose to celebrate in these coming days, I hope at least you give it a try. And of course, if you are already active in reading and engaging with Native American literature and you have any other recommendations, I have read quite a bit of it, but not as much as I would like to. So go ahead and let me know what else maybe I should try to read. And again, keep in mind, reading lists can be a little bit problematic. They can be a little bit dismissive of the nature of a lot of these books. So I hope you have a wonderful day, and thank you for watching.